On the 12th of January 2020, the Doctor Who episode Orphan 55 aired to extremely negative reviews from fans and mixed reviews from critics. This wasn't unusual for episodes written during Chris Chibnall's time as showrunner, but as I remember it, the reaction to this episode in particular was flavored by a particular kind of hatred and contempt that few other standalone episodes of Doctor Who have ever received. So why this episode in particular? Well, if you believe the YouTube comments, it was because fans were sick of having political ideology shoved down their throats, and more so than any other attempt at political messaging in the show's history, felt that they were being lectured rather than entertained. The thing is, though, that Doctor Who hasn't just been trying to engage with the climate since 2020. In fact, it's been shoving environmental ideology down the throats of its viewers since 1964.
What would kill insects in a perfectly ordinary garden? I mean, pests one can understand, but surely it's wrong to kill bees and worms and things, isn't it?
Quite so. Both are vital to the growth of things.
The three-part serial Planet of the Giants opened season 2 of Doctor Who with an ambitious story of corporate sabotage, murder, and the looming threat of environmental catastrophe. The Doctor and his companions, accidentally shrunk down to 1.5 inches, find that the giant planet they have landed on is actually Earth, and the insects that appear to be dying at an alarming rate are being killed by an experimental pesticide. The villain of the serial is Forrester, a greedy capitalist who shoots dead the scientists warning him of environmental and human cost of his new investment. I've not watched much Classic Who, but these episodes were incredibly gripping to watch. The effects were incredible, the tension was palpable, and the story strikes the balance between delivering its message and being genuinely entertaining. So why is it that a story like this can be told in 1964, but not in 2020? To be honest, I think it has much less to do with the political ideology supposedly being rammed down the throats of fans, and everything to do with a far greater sin: bad writing. Like nearly all of Chibnall's era, Orphan 55 is terribly written and poorly executed. I'm certainly not here to argue otherwise. And the people complaining about being lectured to felt this bad writing implicitly, but like many fans of sci-fi content, voiced their dissatisfaction against the supposedly new political ideology of the show instead of taking the time to unpack why the writing didn't work. Of course, some of them did have some more concrete complaints beyond climate change is woke and it makes me feel bad. A few latched onto some logical inconsistencies CinemaSin style and tried to argue their way to explaining how the episode couldn't possibly work due to fixed points. I'm not going to give this argument the time of day, since if you've ever watched a single episode of Doctor Who in your life, you'll know that the show's time travel lore is about as logical and consistent as flat earth science. The other argument that I saw floating around in attacks of the episode was that it was hypocritical for Doctor Who to even make an episode explicitly about the climate.
It's complicated because you can't just, we've got off a flight to come to America to promote our show. So we have a carbon footprint just getting here. And so, there is a complication in what you do. You cannot suggest in any way watching Doctor Who's going to fix the world or anything like that. Of course it isn't.
Does Doctor Who have the right to deal with the topic of climate change, given the irony that the filming likely has a massive carbon footprint? Does any fictional show have that right? Well, it's an oversimplification, but while fantasy often concerns itself with looking backwards, at least in the Western world, worshipping royalty, courts, and medieval culture, sci-fi usually concerns itself with looking forward. It's progressive by nature because it's usually trying to imagine a future that has been transformed in some way by emerging or not yet created technologies. Sci-fi is fun, yes, it's escapist, and it's not a substitute for political and social action. But it also isn't going anywhere as a genre. It has always had something to say about our most pressing social issues, and it always will. Asking if it's hypocritical for Doctor Who to explore climate change is kind of a nil point, in the same way that calling out climate activists for driving is kind of besides the point. The system we're in now means that virtually any attempt at change will have some level of hypocrisy involved, and I genuinely believe that sci-fi is a really good place to explore the nuances of the problems that humanity faces. So to get that question out of the way, yes, I absolutely think that Doctor Who has the right and the responsibility to talk about climate change. And as we've established, this episode was not the show's only attempt over the years. In fact, the more I started to search for environmental messaging in the show, the more I found it. It's just that for the most part, these themes don't really engage with the climate crisis at a deeper level. In Rose, for example, the antagonist is a form of living plastic, set to take over the modern world because it can control all plastic on Earth. But it's less of a critique of the industries and systems that maintain plastic waste, and more that the show simply needed a plotline that dealt with something modern because it was the first episode of the reboot. It's really a shallow framing device, in the same way that the Bells of St. John uses Wi-Fi or Smile uses emojis, an appeal to make the show feel current and usually played for laughs. The Poison Sky and Gridlock deal with ideas of vehicle pollution, but again, they don't really explore any solutions or go beyond a surface level critique. Many episodes use the destruction of the Earth or another planet as a plot device. Examples include Boomtown and Planet of the Dead. Maybe you could argue that these play into people's eco-anxiety on some level. There's also a season-long reference to the bees disappearing, but in the end it has nothing to do with colony collapse. And I guess Library of the Dead is critical of deforestation. The common thread here is that the show rarely engages with these themes with the same emotional reverence that it does for themes like war, companionship, technology, or even death. Most of these examples don't really go beyond a thing bad critique of whatever they're talking about, and they certainly don't engage with themes of choice and human responsibility in the climate crisis. There are a handful of episodes that do engage more deeply with the theme of environmentalism. Examples that come to mind are The Beast Below and The Hungry Earth. The Beast Below could be seen as a metaphor for the exploitation of the Earth's resources, including the animal agriculture industry. It's an emotional and explicit critique of imperialism and capitalism that directly links these systems of oppression to the climate crisis. It engages with questions of individual and voter agency versus government responsibility. And yes, it's not subtle. It beats you over the head with these themes, but it does so in a way that works, with all the classic charm and camp storytelling that sits at the heart of the show. Similarly, The Hungry Earth and the various other Silurian episodes read as a pretty obvious allegory for Indigenous land rights and knowledges. More importantly, these episodes present an ethical conundrum that has no easy answer. In my opinion, this episode gets much closer to making viewers engage with that conundrum by pointing out the cognitive dissonance involved with exploitation at a societal level. And while it ultimately sends the unfortunate message that it's all too hard and we should just wait for progress to arrive, it is still a far more complex look at climate themes than most other episodes. It's a shame that even the best examples on this list leave a lot to be desired. It is difficult to connect with viewers over personal and collective action when you have a show that can rewrite the future. It's hard to move towards nuance when your monster of the week is plastic. And it makes me deeply sad that the episodes that have been explicitly written to tackle the climate crisis have been so poorly written and so poorly received. Climate change is such a unique social problem because it's almost impossible to get people to fully understand or talk about the issue. It is such an emotionally charged, guilt-ridden topic that is far too abstract and existential for most people to engage with without completely shutting down and doing nothing. It turns out all this wonderful objective science we have is kind of for nothing if we can't somehow trick our silly subjective brains into comprehending the problem. It's obvious people aren't responding to the facts and figures, and it's terrifying to think that action really comes down to good storytelling. In her book, Environmental Culture, The Ecological Crisis of Reason, Australian environmental philosopher Val Plumwood discusses the double face of science. This idea that while scientists have been heroes in the story of the climate crisis because they have been instrumental in alerting the world to the problem of climate change, modern science and reason have also created many of the technologies that are actively destroying the Earth. And Plumwood takes this a step further. She says that our faith in technology and science finding the solution to climate change is not actually reasonable, that we are failing to act now based on technologies and solutions we assume might exist in the future, but that don't exist right now. Reason in the form of scientific or technical fix also plays the hero in some alternative, rationalistic, and techno-optimist scenarios. Science will save us, provided we do not lose our nerve or our faith in techno-reason, and our will to continue along our current path, however precarious it may seem. This is the scientific equivalent of saying that all will be well if the edicts of the market are applied with even more severity. It is less than rational because it does not take due account of the possibility of being wrong, as any fully rational position must. In another variation, it is reason in the form of the market economy and technology that will save the problem itself. Perhaps by new discoveries, perhaps by bringing about natural capitalism, which is set to save the day through voluntarily dematerializing the economy and producing wonders of technological innovation such as the hypercar. I know that before I dismissed the comments about fixed points out of hand, and I stand by that in the context of the show, but I think in a more general sense I can understand that tension. We as viewers getting delivered a speech about how the future is safe provided we change our ways are falling into the trap that Plumwood describes. It gives us no motivation when we see a destroyed Earth in our climate fiction and are told that we have the tools to fix it and will do so in some nebulous future. To quote from Science Fiction and Climate Change, a sociological approach, time travel, whether physical or psychic, is perhaps the most improbable novum in the whole of the science fiction repertoire, so it might seem strange to worry about its real-world implications. But the fatalist conclusion that there is little we can do to offset anthropogenic warming and that our efforts might make matters worse does have such implications, and these might well be regretted. Let's try a thought experiment. If you wanted to write an episode about war, for instance, you could set the war zone in the present time, but that would be incredibly dicey. You run the risk of trivializing a real-life war situation by putting it in your silly family sci-fi television program, and run the risk of using real politically charged situations that could alienate the very viewers that need to hear your message the most. So, your other option is setting it in a future or past war zone, giving your viewers some emotional distance in order to get your point across and allowing you to take liberties around historical accuracy or just making up a completely fabricated plot to suit your themes. You could also set the episode on an alien planet with fictional civilizations to achieve a similar distance. And if you do that, it doesn't even necessarily matter if you set it in the past, present, or future, because there's enough distance from real-life human problems that your themes have room to breathe. Broadly speaking, Doctor Who episodes fall into these four categories when giving commentary on any given issue: Earth historical, Earth present, Earth future, and off-world alien. So, a thought experiment then. If you were given one opportunity to write a really good climate change episode for Doctor Who, which of these four settings do you think you would choose? I want you to really think about it, because each setting would have various strengths and weaknesses. I asked 4 people in my real life this question separately. 3 are big Doctor Who fans and 1 has only seen a couple of episodes here and there. The oldest was literally born the same year the original series aired and has watched it since he was a kid, and the youngest was born 1 year after the current reboot started. And you know what's fascinating? All 4 of them said they would choose a historical Earth setting. And for a little bit, this puzzled me, because it sort of seems like the answer people would be least likely to pick. Climate change is usually viewed in media as a future problem, with either present or future solutions. In Doctor Who, climate episodes have pretty much all been tackled in the future or present, or occasionally off-world. But then, I listened to a podcast episode that really helped me understand why. The episode in question is called Canvassing for Climate Action. Here's how to make it work. They discuss the technique of deep canvassing and its use in changing people's minds on divisive political issues. Without getting into an exhaustive explanation of the technique, it's essentially a more emotional and empathetically charged version of traditional door-to-door political canvassing. Instead of reading word for word from a script about the reasons voters should change their minds, deep canvassers have a modified script that allows them to ask voters about their emotions, personal experiences, and values. It was first used to campaign for marriage equality in America in areas that had previously voted against it. In the podcast, they interview an environmental activist who has really struggled to get a town on board for some legislation that every other town in the area has generally been in favor of. They were using traditional canvassing and not having much luck, but when the organizer heard the story of deep canvassing being used to great effect with marriage equality, she decided to try using it on her own campaign. It took over 60 scripts to find something that worked, but in the end, they found that talking about pollution rather than climate change kept people listening for longer. But they really cracked the code when they connected the present legislation with an event in the town's past. They began discussing a time in the town's history when government and industry had worked together to fix a smelter that had been pumping heavy metals and toxic gas into the town, causing environmental damage and health problems for the town's children. Pretty much everyone they talked to had benefited from the action and had watched the town's environment and children's health improve in real time. When you're trying to influence someone's opinion through fiction, using the past can be really effective. Especially if it's based on a real event, people tend to have less resistance to ideas that they perceive as having been around for a long time. The past, tradition, and history are often romanticized in a way that the present simply isn't. When we're talking about a mass extinction event that has already begun to take place and is threatening the future of humanity, it's kind of a downer and is really scary to think about. People's minds shut down. They want to stay in the good old days before they had to think about overconsumption and the fragility of biodiversity, even though the good old days actually had these problems too. I'm someone who cares deeply about the climate crisis. I read a fair amount about it, I vote with the climate in mind, but even for me, my brain shuts down when I start to talk about it. I think none of us are particularly good at comprehending it. So if I were going to write an episode, that would be step one. Set it in the past. Vincent and the Doctor is one of the most beloved and talked about episodes in New Who history, and its reception has been impressive. People who have no intention of even watching the rest of the show sometimes just watch this specific episode because of its themes and storytelling. For those who haven't seen it, it's an episode set in the past and it deals with themes of mental illness, empathy, and history. It is a beautiful, highly emotional story that essentially tries to show how even if someone lives with a severe mental illness, and even if someone ends up taking their own life, the relationships they form, the people that are kind to them, and the impact they have in their lives is still worth something. It's a sort of love letter to the life of Van Gogh, and it raises deeply affecting questions about legacy, mental health, and creative output. In the episode, the Doctor, who is usually the smartest person in the room, the one with all the answers, is suddenly out of his depth, not with the monster of the week, but with the much bigger monster of depression. All his knowledge and swagger amount to nothing against the demons that Van Gogh faces. He and Amy know how Van Gogh's story is going to end. They're aware of the fact Van Gogh will take his own life. In fact, the episode literally begins with them in an art gallery learning of the point where Van Gogh's painting stopped due to his death. But during the course of the episode, the three of them form a connection, and Amy insists on taking Van Gogh to the future for a brief trip to see his legacy, his paintings being remembered and loved by the public for years to come in a way that they weren't during his lifetime. She is utterly convinced that his understanding of this will stop the depression from consuming him, and that when she returns to the future, the number of paintings will have increased. So when she returns and they haven't, I actually remember watching this episode for the first time, and it still hits every time I rewatch it. And it hits you twice as well. Once, when Amy realizes with crushing sadness that, no, the number of paintings is exactly the same. Van Gogh didn't paint anything new, and his depression was not fixed. But the second, far more powerful moment, when she sees that the sunflower painting now bears the words, "For Amy." There is a speech in this episode as well. The Doctor has some poetic things to say about how even if they didn't manage to dampen the bad things in Vincent's life, they still managed to add to the good. The message being that even if he didn't create more work or even live longer, the kindness that they showed Vincent still mattered and still made a difference. It's not the kind of story you'd expect from a family show about a time-traveling alien in a blue box, and that's partly why it's so effective. If someone had set out to write an episode about mental illness, the complexities of severe depression and the stigma and the unkindness people living with it face, and even suicide, it might have been tempting to set it in the present day. After all, we're in the midst of a mental health and suicide crisis, especially amongst young men. But if you did that, you'd run the risk of things hitting a little too close to home. Even though Vincent van Gogh was a real person and his depression was very real, he exists in people's minds as a story from the past. They see his story as fixed, and therefore their attitude towards him remains fairly fixed too. The writer of this episode was inspired by a well-known fact that Van Gogh was never famous in his lifetime. By playing with that known fact in a fictional setting, he was able to inspire a level of empathy and emotion that may not have been possible with a completely fabricated character. He changed the narrative around someone who is often made fun of because of his mental illness. In fact, the writer specifically said he set out to make an episode that had humor in it, but avoided making any of the common jokes about Van Gogh's ears or other elements of spectacle in his life. There's a lot of talk in this episode and the show more broadly about fixed events in time, what can and can't be altered, and what is destined to stay the same forever. In a way, what this episode does is change time and history for its viewers. If someone thinks it's okay to make jokes about Van Gogh's illness, they may justify it to themselves by thinking it was a long time ago, that he no longer exists and cannot be hurt by it. But this episode does what Doctor Who does so brilliantly. It warps time. It humanizes figures of the past and connects them to people living now. There are a lot of scientists out there who have fought tooth and nail for decades to make climate change a known issue, an emergency, in the hopes that it will inspire behavioral and policy change. And largely it hasn't. If I were a climate scientist in today's world, I'd be feeling a very specific kind of existential dread, because what most of them are probably realizing right now is that facts and logic don't really matter. People are driven by feelings. That's literally the basis of the entire global advertising industry and our political systems. It seems that what it comes down to, in many ways, is feelings. That's what's standing between us and saving the human race. And maybe it's a vast oversimplification, but if we can learn anything from the deep canvassing example, it's that people's emotions are really powerful tools when it comes to individual and collective action. And you know what's really, really good at playing with people's emotions? Fiction, storytelling. And I'm by no means suggesting that incorporating climate change into mainstream genre fiction stories is a substitute for real change, but I think it might play a bigger role in the ecosystem of change than it's given credit for. But, and there is a but here, it's totally useless if the stories that incorporate it aren't good. I really hope that we get to see more genuinely impactful stories about the climate crisis. I hope that future writers are taking notes on the failure of its depiction in popular media so that they can do better. I started writing this script with the intention of demonstrating that Doctor Who is bad at climate change episodes. But with a show with so much history and so many intertwined stories from so many storytellers, it's a little more complicated than that. There have been some moments that have been impactful, right from the beginning, just not as many as I'd like. There are a lot of aspiring writers out there who are constantly looking for inspiration, and if that is you, then I highly encourage you to consider the climate in your work. The climate crisis is one of the most emotional and high stakes and interesting challenges that the Earth has ever faced, and if that doesn't have the potential to make good TV, then I don't know what does.